If you've watched my short video of Glenesk and Loch Lee, please bear with me. It was edited from this one, so some parts are very similar, but there's more, much more in this. Good morning, I'm Elma McMenemy, a blue badge qualified Scottish tourist guide, and today I'm going to take you to explore Glenesk and Loch Lee. Glenesk is about 15 miles long and is one of the Angus glens which runs from the lower Grampian Mountains to the Vale of Strathmore. The higher part is in the Cairngorms National Park. It's Britain's largest national park at 4,500 square kilometres. That's almost 1,750 square miles, larger than the European country of Luxembourg. The part we're exploring today is down in the southeast corner, Loch Lee and Glenesk. The River North Esk, which flows through Glenesk, forms a border between present-day Aberdeenshire and Angus, but even going way back in time, it formed the boundary between the ancient Celtic lands of the Mearns and Angus. We're going to have a look at the Rocks of Solitude. More than 400 million years ago, during the period which geologists call the Ordovician, Scotland lay as part of a continent 20 degrees south of the equator. It was called Laurentia, and at that time a fault was created, a geological fault, which today we call the Highland Boundary Fault. It runs south-west from Stonehaven, not far from Glenesk, on the northeast coast, and it runs parallel, more or less, to the Grampian Mountains, southwest across the Scottish mainland. On the mainland, it finishes at Helensburgh, but it does continue to the island of Arran. If you've seen Loch Lomond, the islands in Loch Lomond are actually part of that same fault line, as are these rocks here. The cliff towering above this path is on the north side of the River North Esk. The path comes out to give you a view of where the river flows between two walls of rock cliffs, known as the Rocks of Solitude. The Rocks of Solitude in picturesque Glenesk, also known as the Glen or Valley of the Rowan Trees. Glenesk is seen as being very remote, but it's still a thriving community, mostly agriculture and also shooting and stalking. However, I couldn't do this video live with no mobile signal anywhere in the glen, and for me at least, no access to Wi-Fi. The scenery changes constantly as you walk or drive up the glen. Lots of woodland, which you can see behind me. Not only rowans, which we will see later, but also beech trees. And then suddenly the vista opens up to show you the amazing hills of the lower Grampian Mountains. Oops, did you notice that slip of the tongue? I should, of course, have said birch trees, not beech trees like these, although some can be found at the foot of Glenesk and look wonderful in the autumn. In Scottish folklore, rowan trees like these in the foreground, sometimes called the mountain ash, are meant to provide shelter for benevolent spirits, and so for hundreds of years, people believed that the rowan could give them protection from witches. Here in Glenesk, Scattering rowan leaves on the bed before childbirth was seen as a sure way of protecting the newly born baby between birth and baptism. A little Christian cross would be made from rowan twigs bound with red thread and hung above the cradle, which was painted pale green inside to protect against witches. A similar cross might hang above the front door, and on the farm a rowan branch would be used for herding cattle, and a pin fashioned from rowan wood would be used to close the milk churn, to prevent the witches casting a spell on the milk and turning it sour. It became commonplace to plant rowan trees on either side of the entrance to a house to help protect the inhabitants from the actions of witches and their spells. That still happens in many places today, and you can still see them at the entrances to houses. The building you can see behind me is called the Retreat. Originally it was a small cottage used by a retired naval captain, Captain Weems, as his retreat after retiral from the sea. In 1955, a local school teacher called Greta Michie, good Scottish name Michie, M-I-C-H-I-E, founded what became the Glenesk Folk Museum, which is now housed in the Retreat behind me. The present building is based on a shooting lodge which was built for the landowners. The Folk Museum is closed at the moment because of the global COVID pandemic and also for reconstruction and refurbishment. It has been a fascinating place for ages. The sort of things on show are reconstructions of how people lived, complete with box beds, illicit whisky distilling in the Glen, and all the famous families from the Glen, including the schoolmaster Alexander Ross. He was schoolmaster at Loch Lee, at the head of the Glen, and his desk is actually on show inside the Retreat. Also displayed are musical instruments and stuffed animals and birds showing the wildlife of the Glen. The view from the Retreat's car park is also rather beautiful. Today, Tarfside is the Glen's main community, centre of village life in times gone past, and even in recent times was this building, the Masonic Hall. A place for dances, Burns suppers and many celebrations. Often they were dry. Alcohol was frowned upon, but beneath these stairs is the entrance to what was called the roomie, and those who had the right connections were invited down to the roomie to hae a dram. These days Loch Lee is a reservoir for the north of Angus and the southern part of the Mearns, and so Scottish Water monitors not only the water quality and level but also the fish movement. They can count the salmon at this gauging station. This is the Water of Mark at the place where it enters the River North Esk. This is known as Invermark, and this is the place closest that we can park and walk the rest of the way to the old kirk on the shores of Loch Lee. One part of the track branches off to lead up to Mount Keen and across to Deeside. Passing this, the Queen's Well, where Queen Victoria stopped for refreshments on her way to Fettercairn from Balmoral in 1861. "500 years ago, the Glen was plagued by cattle rustlers. The Cateran, as they were known, came across the Mount, the Grampian Mountains from Deeside, and so the landowners built this Invermark Castle to defend their cattle and to protect their family, their lands and their tenants. And even although today it's a ruin, you can still see what a fine fortification it would have been. A good defence where the guard could watch for the cateran coming to steal the cattle, or anyone trying to sneak into the glen with evil intent. Originally, it would have been quite different on top. It may have been open, there may have been a cap house, and the chimneys we can see today were actually added much later. Later too, lower, smaller buildings were added beside the castle, but these were taken down in the early 1800s, and stone from them, and even the castle itself, together with the slates, were used to build a new church nearby. Up close and personal with Invermark Castle, you can see the defensive slits, and also higher up the windows. And the reason why there's no access today. Sadly, the building is dangerous. You can also see the old foundations of some of these other buildings. Back in the 1590s, the landowner, who was David Lindsay, believed that there were precious minerals on his land in the glen. And looking at the stone today, glinting slightly in the sunshine, you can see why he might have believed that. He imported miners from Germany, and they did indeed find lead, quicksilver, and small quantities of silver and gold, but the mines weren't viable. Much later, in 1728, there was a proper mining trial on a seam of lead which is now known to run east to west through the glen. However, the mines were never developed. In times gone by, plants and flowers were used as natural remedies, and bog myrtle, which is particularly abundant in the glen even today, is well known for its rejuvenating properties and is used in modern cosmetics. This little purple plant, devil's bit scabious, was used as a cure for anything from scabies to the plague, from fevers to toothache, and its root was used as a natural dye. Fungi were also used for vegetable dyes, usually giving green or yellow colours, but if fermented they could give rich browns and reds too. Glenesk and Invermark are a haven for all sorts of wildlife. Earlier I thought I'd seen a couple of golden eagles. However, it's much more likely that they were buzzards. Seeing them against the sky from a distance, it's very difficult to tell the scale you're looking at. And of course you can see some of the other wildlife on the poster here. Sometimes there's also adders earlier in the summer. Way in the distance, on that hilltop, the Hill of the Rowans, stands the Mall Memorial, also known as the Rowan Tower. It was erected around 1866-1867 by the first Baron Panmure, whose name was Fox Mole, in memory of deceased members of the Mole family, and that included Lady Ramsay MacDonald, the Lady Christian Mole, and Lord Panmure himself. The inscription on it says, "When it shall please God to call them hence." Today, Loch Lee is a reservoir and provides really good drinking water to the north part of Angus and the southern part of the Mearns. So the loch is actually dammed. You can just see the top of the dam beyond the gates. And that means that the water level in the loch is much higher than it was in former times. And of course, the water level in the river is much lower normally. This part of the river, the Water of Mark, is known locally as the Monk's Pool. It's thought that originally there was a Chaldee monastery on the shores of Loch Lee, and that the monks had the right to fish for salmon in this part of the river during Lent. There's a huge expanse of the loch. It runs roughly east to west. We're looking west at the moment. It's about 2 kilometres long and just over 600 metres wide, and it's about 37 metres or 20 fathoms deep. The name Loch Lee comes from Gaelic, and it means either the loch or lake of the flood place or the smooth loch. Believe it or not, these video clips were filmed just a short time apart. The loch lies at 900 feet above sea level, just under 300 metres, and that means that the weather can change really rapidly. At the east end is the place where the church was built, although today sadly only a ruin remains. The kirk was founded by St Drosten in the 7th century, possibly on the site of an old Chaldee monastery. Around 1,000 years later, during what's known as the Covenanting Wars, the church and the kirk town were burned by the Marquis of Montrose. After the Marquis of Montrose's visit, a new church was built, complete with a laird's loft for the landowner and his family to sit in privacy during the church services. On the hillside behind it was the parish school, and I'd like to share a story with you. The story of Alexander Ross, probably Loch Lee's most famous resident, although he wasn't born here. He was schoolmaster here for over 50 years. On the other side of these mountains is the valley we now know as Royal Deeside. That's where Alexander Ross was born, in the parish of Kincardine-O'Neill, where he attended the village school, won a bursary to Marischal College in Aberdeen, where he studied in the most turbulent of times, the 1715 Jacobite uprising. After graduation, he worked as a tutor for the Forbes family of Craigievar and Fintry. Before coming to Loch Lee, he also taught in a couple of parish schools and married Jean Catanach, also from Deeside. On that hillside behind me, just beside the trees and in amongst the bracken, you can maybe see some of the stones of the old schoolhouse. Alexander Ross came here at the age of 33, a young teacher, a young husband and father, and he stayed here by Loch Lee as a schoolmaster until he died at the age of 85. He taught the children of 6 or 7 Glen families. His salary was £5.11 per year, but he also got turfs, peat from Invermark Hill for his fire, balls of grain, and the field that you can see behind, about 6 acres of arable land to cultivate. Back then in the 1700s, arable land and pasture was in high demand. Very little of the land in the glen could actually be cultivated. When Alexander Ross first came to Loch Lee, he was very much on probation, although he'd already taught in Lordenskirk and in Aboyne. The reason was that his wife, Jean Catanach, was said to be descended from the Ducats of Auchenhove, who were staunch Jacobites and Catholics. And so Alexander Ross didn't have his position as schoolmaster confirmed until 12 months after they arrived, and he didn't get his full payment until 12 months after he arrived. However, he and Jean obviously attended church, took part in services. He became session clerk and precentor. The precentor would lead the congregation in their singing. The session clerk took to do with all the administration for the church. Amongst other things, he would record the baptisms, marriage banns and burials in the parish. and it was normal for session clerks to be paid sixpence for recording these special life events. Alexander Ross tells us in his own words that this did not happen. Nobody asked him to record the baptisms of their children or paid him his dues for doing so, with the exception of one man. In fact, he made a footnote about this in the baptismal record in 1745, and you can read on scotlandspeople.gov.uk in his own handwriting exactly why he did this. He believed it would be beneficial for generations to come. A man before his time, you might say. Or perhaps he didn't want his own children's baptisms to be the only ones showing in the parish record. However, he was paid an additional £2 per year for being precentor and session clerk. He is arguably Loch Lee's most famous son. You may never have heard of him, but Rabbie Burns certainly had, and he influenced the bard Rabbie Burns with his writing. His best-known work is an epic poem, 4,000 lines, written in the Doric, the local vernacular. As was popular in the 1700s, it's about a shepherdess, a wee lass who grew up in this glen. I must say it's not the easiest of epic poems to read, but it was lauded in his lifetime, to the extent that the famous Duchess Jean, the Duchess Gordon, who later went on to help found the Gordon Highlanders Regiment with her husband and son, the Duchess Jean actually sponsored an edition of Eleanor, and Alexander Ross travelled from this remote Loch Lee and Glen way across the mountains to visit the Gordons at Gordon Castle near Fauchebers. Alexander Ross's wife Jean predeceased him, and this is a stone he had erected for her. There is space there. No doubt he expected his own name to be added, but it never was. He was buried not here against the wall, and neither does Jean lie here. In fact, they are under the much more modern memorial to Alexander Ross. The original memorial was moved to make space for this one in the middle of the 1800s. At that time, the laird, the landowner, was appalled that there was no memorial for Alexander Ross, and so this was commissioned. However, it was erected in the wrong place, at the new church down by Invermark Castle. Eventually, after 13 years, it was moved here, and Jean's stone was moved to the wall. I've been privileged to come here several years in the company of one of Alexander Ross's descendants, a lady from Tasmania, where he has many descendants, in fact. And in this year, when she cannot come herself, I brought a few flowers from my garden to lay to remember Jean, her 6 times great-grandmother, and her 6 times great-grandfather Alexander Ross. You may notice the flowers are just tied with some simple string. Hopefully that will biodegrade over time. It would have been better to use a few blades of grass just to bind the flowers together, because in a place like this, in the Cairngorms National Park, you wouldn't want to be leaving shop-bought flowers with ribbons and cellophane, which just provide a blot on the landscape eventually. By the time Alexander Ross died in 1784, there were roughly 600 people living in the whole glen, but it was a very scattered community. Here, by the church, was the Kirkton, the largest settlement in this westerly part of the glen. The steep, rocky-sided hills meant that very little of the glen could be cultivated, although this glen, Glen Unig, to the west of Loch Lee, was one of 3 glens used as pasture in the 1700s. We know there were 300 black cattle grazed here each summer, and the glen keeper was paid 1 shilling and 6pence per head of cattle. The steep hills which surround the loch, which you can see from this map, provide a perfect frost pocket. That made for a very short growing season, and it was a battle each year to get the land ploughed, sown, and the harvest in before winter returned. The sun is blinding today, mid-afternoon in mid-autumn, but the weather can change really rapidly here. We're at 900 feet, about 280 metres above sea level. It only takes a little wind blowing along the loch to create big waves. And in winter, the sun doesn't rise above the hills in the south and west. In Alexander Ross's day, in midwinter, the sun never reached the schoolhouse window up there on the hillside. Despite the harsh climate, or perhaps because of it, the air in the glen is considered healthy. But back in May 1782, following a very cold and wet spring, a fever came to the glen. The minister wrote that it was similar to an inflammation of the pleura, and the people affected had their spittle mixed with blood. Within a few hours after the fever seized them, they felt a pain below their left pap and died upon the 5th or 6th day. The fever affected mostly people over the age of 30, and all but 2 of the 37 people infected died. In the space of 6 weeks, 35 people were buried in this churchyard. The arable land was poor, and it's easy to see why it was so scattered along the length of the glen. By the middle of the 1800s, it was estimated there was only 1,400 acres actually cultivated, whereas there were over 60,000 acres which had never been cultivated. Not everybody worked in agriculture. There were tradesmen too, but some of these worked part-time at their trade, like the Wrights and the Smiths, who also raised a few sheep and cattle. But there were also tailors and weavers and a shoemaker in the glen. The lower land and more benign climate in the east part of the glen provided a much better living, and so people gradually moved east, escaping the harsh west end of the glen. The new church was built in the early 1800s near Invermark Castle, and by the middle of that century, with Victorians being great hunters, the landowners brought in deer, displacing thousands of sheep from the land. They also provided grouse on the moorland, and so the Victorian gentlemen could enjoy their stalking and shooting. And indeed, in addition to sheep farming, it's stalking deer and shooting grouse and pheasant and fishing for trout and salmon, which are the main activities in the glen today. After the people moved east, of course, the church fell into disrepair and became a ruin, and the kirk town is no more.